The night air was heavy with tension as I watched her pack her things. Marissa, my cheating wife, moved mechanically, throwing clothes into her suitcase like a robot. The woman who had promised love, loyalty, and partnership had turned our marriage into a battlefield of lies and betrayal. I stood by the doorway, arms crossed, not out of anger anymore, but out of a cold, calculated patience. Months of manipulation, secret phone calls, and late-night excuses had led to this inevitable moment. I remembered the first time I caught her in a lie. It was subtle, an extra lipstick on the counter, a text disappearing from her phone just as I walked into the room. I brushed it off initially, wanting to believe in the woman I thought I knew. But the breadcrumbs kept piling up. And then came the night that shattered everything. She had promised me she was at her mother's house. I drove by just to check, and saw her laughing in a cafe with a man whose face I never wanted to see in my life. My heart sank, but my mind began to work. I didn't yell, I didn't explode. I watched. I took notes. I prepared. Now, months later, I had the leverage she never saw coming. My father's prenup, a document I had discovered while going through old papers, became my secret weapon. It was ironclad. Everything she had hoped to manipulate, money, property, assets, was locked behind a wall of legality she couldn't touch. She had been so confident, so arrogant, in thinking she could bend reality to her will. I had always played by the rules, quietly building my life, but I was no longer willing to be blind to her deceit. The tension in the air was palpable. She glanced at me once, with a fleeting mix of defiance and fear, then returned to packing. I let the silence stretch, the weight of anticipation crushing in the room. This was not a scene for dramatics. It was a reckoning. Every item she touched, every piece of clothing folded hastily into the suitcase, reminded me of every betrayal, every whispered excuse, every stolen moment I had been denied. And then came the moment she realized. She picked up the final envelope, her name written on it in my father's precise handwriting, and froze. What is this?" she stammered, voice cracking slightly. I didn't need to answer. The look on her face, a mixture of panic, disbelief, and humiliation, said everything. She had always underestimated the quiet ones, the patient ones, the ones who wait for the perfect moment to act. Her hands shook as she held the prenup, flipping through the pages with mounting horror. Every asset she had assumed would be hers, every property, every financial account, every entitlement she had plotted for, none of it could touch her now. My father had been meticulous, ensuring that any attempt at manipulation would collapse before it even began. And collapse it did. I watched her slowly sink to the floor, her suitcase abandoned at her feet. The woman who had once walked into my life with a smile, pretending innocence, was now reduced to a trembling figure of panic and regret. I don't understand," she whispered, almost pleading. But understanding was not necessary. The reality was in front of her, unyielding and undeniable. She had gambled with deceit and lost. The months of preparation, the careful gathering of proof, the quiet observation of her interactions, they all converged into this singular moment of reckoning. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to yell. Revenge, in its purest form, was not about spectacle, it was about precision. And precision had always been my ally. Her phone buzzed incessantly, messages from friends, family, colleagues, people who had once been her allies now irrelevant in the face of this legal barrier. Each vibration, each notification, was a reminder that the world she thought she controlled had slipped entirely from her grasp. She had relied on charm, deceit, and the ignorance of others to navigate life, but her strategy had failed spectacularly. I remembered the nights I had lain awake, imagining scenarios, plotting my response. Not out of malice alone, but out of the need for justice, for closure. She had taken so much from me emotionally, mentally, and even financially. Now it was time for her to confront the consequences of her choices. Slowly, she began to pack again, not because she had control, but because reality left her no choice. The prenup dictated the rules, and she had no leverage to challenge them. Her arrogance had been her undoing. I stepped closer, my voice calm, almost clinical. "It's over," I said. "Everything you expected, it's not yours. Every plan you made to manipulate the future? Gone. It's time to leave." The weight of the situation settled fully upon her shoulders. I had anticipated this reaction, but witnessing it firsthand, the shock, the disbelief, the humiliation, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. She had underestimated patience, underestimated diligence, underestimated the quiet ones who wait for the perfect moment. And now, there was nothing left for her here. By the time she stepped out the door, the night had deepened into a cold, unforgiving silence. Marissa carried nothing but her ruined pride and the realization that every scheme she had plotted had come crashing down. I closed the door behind her, the sound echoing like a final punctuation mark on a chapter she had written herself into. There would be no dramatics, no shouting matches, no attempts at reconciliation. Justice, in its purest form, required no fanfare. It simply existed, undeniable and unassailable. I walked through the house, surveying the remnants of a life she had tainted. Every photograph, every memento of happier times, now felt tainted by betrayal. But I allowed myself a moment of clarity, a breath of relief. This was not victory born of malice, but of patience and principle. She had underestimated the power of rules, the foresight of preparation, and the quiet resolve of someone wronged but composed. She had thought that charm and manipulation could bend reality. She had been spectacularly wrong. Weeks passed, and the ripple effects of her actions became apparent. Friends who had once encouraged her schemes now recoiled. Family members who had blindly supported her reconsidered their positions. And the man she had hoped to ensnare with her deceit found himself disentangled from the chaos she created. I remained detached, observing the consequences without gloating, knowing that the prenup had done more than protect me. It had allowed her to face the weight of her own choices. The most satisfying part of it all wasn't the legal protection or the financial security, it was the clarity. The moment she realized that her manipulations had no purchase on reality, that every plan had been anticipated and nullified, was the moment she truly understood the consequences of betrayal. I hadn't needed to raise a hand, hadn't needed to yell or fight. The law, preparation, and patience had been my instruments, and they had struck with precision. I sat alone in the quiet house one evening, reflecting on everything that had transpired. Life had a way of balancing itself, often in ways the unprepared never anticipated. Marissa had assumed she could manipulate the people, the law, and the circumstances to her favor. But she had failed to account for vigilance, careful planning, and the inevitable justice that follows deceit. She was homeless, stripped of the illusions she had relied on, and left to face the consequences of her own choices. And as I watched the sun rise the next morning, I felt a calm resolve wash over me. The storm of betrayal had passed, and what remained was a life rebuilt on clarity, principle, and quiet strength. Revenge had not been loud. It had been methodical, inevitable, and complete. She had learned, the hard way, that deception carries a price, and some of us are willing to wait a lifetime to ensure it is paid in full.